Joining me now here in Washington, Republican Senator John McCAIN of Arizona, on your maiden voyage here on the show with me. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Candy.
Before we get to domestic policy, I want to talk to you about North Korea. Try to give our audience some perspective on how dangerous this is. And I ask because it seems to me we go through this periodically. All of a sudden, North Korea, tests a missile, fires into South Korean, at least water territory. Is this any more dangerous than anything in the past, and what does that mean to the average American?
Well, I think it's probably more dangerous in that the North Koreans have enhanced capability, both missile and nuclear capability, but it's also a lesson that continued appeasement of North Korea, which we've been doing basically under Republican and Democrat administration since 1994 with agreed upon framework. We've given the North Koreans over $1 billion worth of aid and assistance in the last 15 years or so, and based on the premise that we would all get together and negotiate. It seems the purpose of everything is to get the North Koreans to the table. The North Koreans' only claim to their position on the world stage is their nuclear capability. And they have a terrible, most repressive, oppressive regime in the world. They have hundreds of thousands of people in slave labor camps. And all of that seems to be sacrificed in the altar of, quote, negotiations. Long ago, we should have put significant pressures on the North Koreans. Even in the Bush administration, we freed up a $25 million bank account and took them off the terrorist list. So could I just finally say the key to this, obviously, is China. And unfortunately, China is not behaving as responsible world power. It cannot be in China's long-term interest to see a renewed conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We've got to understand that China is not what we want it to be, but is not playing a responsible role on the world stage, much less in on the Korean Peninsula. They could bring the North Korean economy to its knees if they wanted to. And I cannot believe that the Chinese should, in a mature fashion, not find it in their interest to restrain North Korea. So far, they are not.
You have called it, what North Korea's done is unacceptable. You have called on China to react strongly. They have said, let's get the group of 6 together, not for talks on nuclear, on North Korea's nuclear capability, but about this. Let's have an emergency meeting. Is that a good first step?
I think it'd be a fine first step, but do we really think that there's been this long history of confrontation that the North Koreans have practiced is going to come to a halt without significant penalties on North Korea?
From China.
I think it's time I think it's time we talked about regime change in North Korea. And I do not mean military action, but I do believe that this is a very unstable regime. They're now passing on from the dear leader to what we call the sweet leader, or whatever it is, 27-year-old 4-star general. So, and we can have a peaceful resolution to this issue, but the North Korean regime is not one that's going to abandon the nuclear power status. They are now seeking recognition from us that they are a nuclear nation. That's not in our interest.
I want to move on to Afghanistan, but to button this up,
would you... One other thing. The Chinese, now the United States is engaged in military operations with South Korea in the Yellow Sea. The Chinese have claimed the Yellow Sea as a special economic zone. We have to understand that China is not behaving in a responsible fashion as a world power, and we have to make adjustments to our policies regarding China.
And just to button this up, are we on the verge, is the Korean Peninsula on the verge of war, or is this something that is a more long-term problem?
I think if past behavior holds true, the North Koreans will walk up to the edge and then step back and try to get more concessions and more money and more economic aid and more jobs for North Koreans sponsored by South Korea. I'm not sure that the South Koreans are going to go along this time.
Let me ask you about Afghanistan. New report out, the one that they give twice a year. They called military and security gains fragile. They said the efforts to reduce insurgency capacity in Pakistan has not produced measurable success. They said the Taliban has sufficient capability and support to pose a threat to the viability of the government, and if the security situation erodes, that quickly the security will erode, quickly the stability in the region will erode. We've been there 9 years. At this point, isn't it a legit question to say, you know, can we really do this? Because it seems to grow worse.
I think that's why we're going to have an assessment next month in December, as you know. I just came back with Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman. We have made significant military successes. In the clear and hold area, we have been making, thanks to General Petraeus and the brave young men and women who are serving, we are making great progress. We are. I mean, I don't have any doubt that we are in that area. There are two major problems right now. One of them is corruption at the highest levels of government. They have a corrupt attorney general. This latest business about the elections is really unacceptable, and a sanctuary in Pakistan. The Pakistanis are still, and the armed military with the ISI, are still having businesses with the cooperating with the Haqqani network and other Taliban elements within Afghanistan. You cannot allow the enemy sanctuary. These are significant problems, and
they've been
they
significant
need to be
problems, though, for years. So you got to kind of wonder: are we ever going to make a dent in this? And let me just ask, as a last part of this: does a 2014 agreed-upon deadline for the removal of combat troops by both NATO and U.S. forces, is that helping?
It's a dramatic improvement over the 2011 date that the president had been sponsoring, which was an enormous impediment to progress because people were adjusting to us leaving in 2011. I'm very happy to see 2014. Let me just say, if it wasn't a corrupt government, if we didn't have the trouble with Pakistan that we have, things would be a lot better in Afghanistan. And remember, it's only been since the president announced at West Point that we would really increase the number of troops there, and General Petraeus' appointment, with all due respect to General McChrystal, that we have really started to make some improvements. We cannot afford for Afghanistan to return to being a base for attacks on the United States of America. And we should never forget that. And finally, could I just mention, Candy, the Taliban are not popular. The Taliban are hated by most of the people of Afghanistan. It's not as if they're a popular movement.
But they're scared of them, and so they don't.
Of course they're scared. They're scared to death of them. But to say that the Afghan people would welcome them with open arms is just, I mean, and think of the women's rights issues and all of these other cruelties that the Taliban have inflicted upon the people of Afghanistan.
Let me ask you about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's going to come up. You're going to have testimony for the Armed Services Committee. You have criticized what you believe will be in this upcoming report about how the military feels, saying, no, this was about how are we going to implement it, not about how the military feels. I know you got a letter from Robert Gates, the Defense Secretary, which said in part to you, I do not believe that military policy decisions should, on this or any other subject, be subject to referendum of service members. In other words, you know, what the service members, how they would vote is sort of immaterial to what we're trying to do. Doesn't he have a point?
Well, I think he certainly has a point. I would also certainly say that we should remember where this all started. There was no uprising in the military. There was no problems in the military with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was a political promise.
There was a problem.
No, it wasn't, because it wasn't a problem, because you didn't have, it's called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, okay? If you don't ask somebody, we don't ask somebody, and they don't tell, and it's an all-volunteer force, okay? And I understand your point of view, and I understand the point of view by the majority of the media, but the fact is, this was a political promise made by an inexperienced president or candidate for presidency of the United States. The military is at its highest point in recruitment and retention and professionalism and capability. So to somehow allege that this policy has been damaging the military is simply false. So the fact is that this system is working, and I believe that we need to assess the effect on the morale and battle effectiveness of those people that those young Marines and Army people I met in forward operating bases that are putting their lives on the line every day. This is an all-volunteer force. And if we want to make sure that morale and battle effectiveness is maintained, that's why people like the Commandant of the Marine Corps has come out against repeal. Now, if you want to call him a racist and others, and like the sergeants and others that I have... We should also
point out the Defense Secretary and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff think it's a good idea. But can I ask you this? And
they have said that, and the four service chiefs have all had reservations to one degree or another. Now, I have great respect for the Secretary of Defense, and I have great respect for the Secretary, for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I have great respect for the service chiefs, and I have great respect to the men and women who are serving, particularly the sergeants and the chief petty officers, who are the ones that make the military work.
Integration of any sort has always come, whether it's racial, whether it's gender. Doesn't it require leadership rather than followership? And in other words, yes, it matters how the military feels, but don't you need to lead when it comes to a matter of integration, which definitely was difficult?
Look, we're in 2 wars. We're in 2 wars. I ran with a master sergeant in a forward operating base outside Kandahar who had 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He said, and a number of them came to me and said, look, we fight together, we sleep together, we eat together. I want to know the effect of our ability to win this conflict. That's what we're saying. I want to know the effect on battle effectiveness and morale, not on how best to implement a change in policy. I don't think that's a lot to ask when we have our young men and women out there serving and fighting, and tragically, some of them dying.
I have less than 30 seconds here, but I have to ask you about Sarah Palin. New book out that you're going to read sooner or later. She's going to Iowa. She's going to South Carolina. The big game is she going to run for president? Isn't she going to run for president? You know her probably better than any politician does. How do you read what's going on?
I think she's keeping her options open, and I think she should. I think she is an incredible force in the American political arena. She's done,
and a divisive force, would you agree?
I think that anybody who has the visibility that Sarah has is obviously going to have some divisiveness. I remember that a guy named Ronald Reagan used to be viewed by some as divisive.
So she's sort of on a... Do you see her as a parallel to...
I think she's doing a great job. No, I think she's doing a great job. I think she has motivated our base. I think she had a positive impact on the last election, and I'm proud of her.
Senator John McCain, there's never enough time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it.